Why hasn't the U.S. government adopted price controls in response to the Federal Reserve's inflationary policies? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. Welcome to this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that you all know brings you the principled case for the libertarian philosophy. I'm joined by Richard Ebeling, my co-host who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again this week.
It's good to be with you and our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, okay, Richard. People lament sometimes in the libertarian movement that we're just not making any progress. But I challenge that. I think we've made progress in a number of areas. And one of these areas deals with a subject that really is a part of the burning issue of our time, and that's the inflation that the Federal Reserve has engaged in for the last 10 years. And then all of a sudden freaking out because prices started rising in response to the debasement of the currency, have raised interest rates in an attempt to get the inflation rate back down from 7 or 8, 10% down to the preferred target that they want for 2%. Now, that's not the progress I'm talking about, obviously. But there is one aspect of this that I find very intriguing, and that's the subject of price controls. Now, the American Institute for Economic Research just published an article talking about price controls that we link to in our daily FFF Daily, our Libertarian Commentary page, which, by the way, I would recommend everyone subscribe to, that's indicating that other countries are adopting price controls in response to the price increases from the inflationary policies of their central banks. But notice that we don't have any price controls in this country. Now, there might be some people here and there calling for price controls, but I really haven't come across any or very many. It's certainly not a widespread topic in the mainstream press. I think this is tremendous progress because 20, 25, 30 years ago, that would have been the first response to the inflationary debasement of the currency. We now have to do price controls. And so I think that we ought to celebrate this phenomenon. I think it's clearly the libertarians that have just quenched any thirst to move in this direction. But I think it behooves us to revisit this subject and sort of, hammer the point home that this would be an absolute disaster. If you take, for example, the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, what they're trying to do with this kind of nonsense is distract people's attention away from the real cause of inflation. And that's the Federal Reserve, the central bank, expansion of money and credit, which then causes the value of people's money to decrease. And that decrease in the value can only be reflected in the prices that people pay to buy things. There's no other way that debasement is going to be reflected. So when you see prices rise across the board, you know that the government is inflating the money supply. Now, we also always know that in any market, the price of something may be rising while the price of something else is dropping. That's not what I'm talking about. That's just straight laws of supply and demand on goods and services. I'm talking about when prices are rising across the board, you know that the government's up to no good. And this is what they've been doing ever since the Federal Reserve was established, as you and I have been documenting ever since FFF got established. They're debasing the money supply. So they enact these ridiculous laws like the Inflation Reduction Act, which raise people's taxes, saying, we're fighting inflation. It's ridiculous. Well, that's what the same thing with price controls, that they say, you see, the prices are rising, so we're going to put a control on these prices. See, we're fighting inflation, because they define inflation as the results of what the Federal Reserve is doing, the price increases, rather than attacking the Federal Reserve itself. And one of the best examples of this phenomenon took place, I think it was back in the 70s, where you had those long lines at the gasoline stations, where you had to sit in line for hours sometimes just to get your car filled up. And they were blaming this on OPEC, that, OPEC is restricting supply. Again, another way to distract away from what they were doing over here. And that was enacting price controls. They enacted price controls on gasoline. And the result always is a shortage, because people are not going to produce or sell something unless they're able to make the profit at the market price. So if you put this artificial cap, the business is going to go out of business because it's still paying inflationary prices on everything else, its employees, its products, the food that it sells in the gasoline store, and so forth. So they say, the heck with it, we won't sell the gas. And then so you get these long lines, because then you get rationing as well. And what was amusing about the whole controversy is the day they finally lifted the price controls, the long lines disappeared. I mean, the shortages went away. Now, prices obviously went up, but that's the point I'm making here, is that you've got to let the price system work. Even in this inflationary debauchery, prices are signals that this is what the government's doing. And that's why they put these price controls on. They don't like those signals. They don't want people to get the signals as to what government's doing to the money supply. But of course, you end up with these perverse results. And then finally, they have to lift the price controls, as they did with gasoline, and everything works out with respect to prices, but not with the inflation. You've got to continue focusing on the cause of the problem. That's the Federal Reserve. What do you think, Richard?
Well, to follow the analogy, I mean, price controls are like a thermometer that you use to take someone's temperature. And the mercury in the old-fashioned thermometer rises, but you don't like its reading. So you put something over the mercury to prevent it from rising and indicating the real temperature that the person is suffering from. And you say, well, see, there's no problem. Well, you're dealing with suppressing the instrument that is supposed to tell you an important element of a symptom that should lead you to asking, what is the cause for the illness? So this is what is done. I mean, when prices are controlled, prices are not allowed to do their job, which is to do two things which you were alluding to inform producers what it is that consumers want and the values they place upon it in the form of the prices they are willing and interested in paying, and to tell consumers what producers believe they can supply something at, given their own cost of manufacturing and the opportunity cost of using their resources in other ways, so as to find out what they'd be willing to pay, given what the suppliers say they could afford to do it at. And if you don't allow prices to do this, then you cause all these mismatches and imbalances, these shortages that you're talking about. I once wrote an article in which I said price controls are an attack on freedom of speech. We talk about freedom of speech in many ways. We talk about freedom of speech in the written form. We share and exchange ideas on any conceivable subject. Freedom of speech in terms of verbal conversation. We talk to each other in conversations, debate, arguments, sharing the views that we have. And all of this is considered essential to the free flow of ideas, information, knowledge, the discovery of new things you perhaps had not thought about, the correcting of errors, and through correction of errors by someone telling you something in a written or verbal form, to rethink your own thoughts, to put you maybe in a better direction. Well, prices have that purpose. Prices are a communications mechanism through which we talk to each other, both across the street and around the world. And unless we allow prices to serve as this medium of communication, then supplies are not matching demand, demand are not adjusting to available supplies, new underlying circumstances underneath the supply and demand on the consumption side or the production side are not constantly being adapted and reflected in these little minute ways about new market conditions to which people have to learn about and then adapt to be coordinating with what they're doing with multitudes of others, both in their own country and around the world, with others who they're interconnected with through the division of labor, the global division of labor. All of this is prevented when prices are controlled. You use the example of the 1970s when Nixon imposed price controls. And I remember being on those lines. I was living in Los Angeles. And not only did they impose price controls, but they did rationing. And there were two elements to this rationing. First, the government started allocating how many gallons of millions of gallons of gas would go to the Northeast, the Southwest, the the central plain states and so on. And what did they use as a guide? They used as a guide, well, how much gasoline was being used last summer? And that's how they determined the allocation for this new year with the controls in place. But the problem, once there were controls in place, people had to readjust and adapt how often they traveled, where they traveled to, whether they could afford to take a vacation here. So the government had allocated the supplies based upon the statistical data of the previous summer. This first summer with the controls, people did totally different things. And as a consequence, the demands were totally mismatched from where the government had allocated the supplies. And that was making these shortages even worse. You had too much in area X and dramatically too little in area Y. And then also, my cracky, talk a little louder, Sonny, maybe some of our, dare I say, older viewers and listeners who lived through this episode may remember that the government then told you when you could go get gasoline at the gasoline station. Did your license plate, right, on the back of your car, did your license plate end in an odd number or an even number? And I'm not going to quite remember this right, but it was like if your car ended in an even number, you could get gas on Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays. If it was an odd number, you did it like Tuesday, Thursdays, and Saturdays. Sunday, I don't know. Maybe the bureaucrats had to rest like God. So, I don't know what happened on Sunday. But you would get on these long lines. And of course, it would go around for blocks. And of course, someone gets up there and now the line has to move, but everybody has to restart their car because you're concerned that if you don't keep your car off until you have to move, the length of a car to closer to the pump. Well, what if there's no gas when I finally get to the pump and I've used it just idling, waiting to get to the pump? And again, at least in Southern California, where I was, they were limiting you. You couldn't get more than 10 gallons of pop for each visit. And it was summertime and people are waiting on these long lines and getting out of their car, and they would get into fistfights and arguments because everybody's getting irritated from both the heat and the line. It was an absolute total disaster. And then, Nixon resigns and we have Gerald Ford and they had these buttons, whip inflation, as if, this is an enemy attacking us. We have to beat inflation. No. The fact was, this inflation was caused by the fact that first with Lyndon Johnson and then with Richard Nixon and into the Gerald Ford years, the fact is government was determined with the Vietnam War to be assuring that people had both guns and butter, but they didn't want to tax the people enough to have a balanced budget of we're going to spend this on all the welfare programs at home and fighting a war abroad. So as a consequence, they had to resort to the deficits are a lot bigger now, but they were huge by the standards of the 1960s and 70s. Have the Federal Reserve just print up the money. So with all this extra money in the economy, people have more cash to spend on goods and services. The prices are starting to be bid up. And now instead of allowing them to tell the truth of what people want and the amount they want and where they want it, as expressed in admittedly these monetary induced inflated prices, no, they impose this cap. And as a consequence, prices could not tell the truth. And once they couldn't tell the truth, then you did have to rely upon government deciding the rationing and the allocations. And as a consequence of this, the entire economy was a disaster. The additional thing was, what happens next? Thomas Sowell in his book, Basic Economics, always makes the point of telling his readers and his students, it's not enough to focus on what is seen, what happens immediately. Ask, what is the unseen? That is, okay, but what happens now? What's next? And what happened once you had those price controls on, which were due with the OPEC embargo, because the U.S. was supporting Israel as much as Western Europe was. Suddenly, it was unprofitable to drill for or explore for alternative sources. There was huge known reserves of oil in Texas, but they had capped those long ago because the price had been so low that since they were further in the ground, it wasn't worth extracting them out of the existing wells. They had been capped. Well, since the price was not allowed to rise, there was no profit incentive to take the cap off. And now with the higher price, to dig deeper out of the known wells and the known reserves. And first of all, there was no incentive to explore more. But once these restrictions began to be eliminated in the mid and late 70s, guess what happened? The Texas oil started flowing. The exploration was undertaken, and we got the North Slope of Alaska with the time lag of exploring and drilling and the pipelines to start bringing it forward. And in Europe, which in fact had not imposed similar stringent price controls, they began to see the exploration of oil possibilities in what became the huge oil fields in the North Sea between Scandinavia and Great Britain. So all of this was delayed. All of this was retarded. The market's natural response to where the signals are telling businessmen, entrepreneurs, enterprises, what's more profitable, what's less profitable. Let's fill the gap of where demand is intense to start over time bringing about a greater supply, which then naturally brings about a competitive reduction in the price. All of that was eliminated and prevented. And if I could just talk about one other instance of the absurdity of these price controls, and that's World War II. The economy was taken over by the government here in the United States. No, industries weren't nationalized, but government now was centrally directing what got produced, where it got produced, whom the output was sold for the needs of the war effort, which had to have priority. And price controls were imposed on everything. And you were given ration coupons. So what did you suddenly have? If you went to the movie theaters, that was obviously before my time, I've only read about this. If you went to the movie theaters, before the main feature, they'd have the little government propaganda shorts about how you have to be a good patriotic American. Don't buy those black market tires. Don't try to bribe the local butcher to get more meat from the back room of the butcher shop than your ration book allows you to have. Don't be siphoning off gas from that truck in the alley because your ration coupons don't allow you to have as much gas for your car as you would like. And oh my God, you don't have the coupon to justify you getting a new suit of clothes. Don't you try to bribe that guy to make you a suit of clothes in the back room of the haberdasher. Oh no, don't do that. All of these kinds of distortions and illegalities and corruptions just follow all of this. This was the reality of wherever you impose price controls, which inevitably results in government having to ration the supply, different how people want to spend their own money as they see, and having the incentives for people to give them what they want.
Yeah, that's an excellent exposition of price controls. I was kind of smiling when you talked about Gerald Ford's button. It was actually whip inflation now.
Yeah, that was it. Whip inflation now.
When see that
yes,
it was
when.
like
That's right. When.
Because like you say, it was like this foreign enemy inflation that has invaded the United States. I mean, it was sort of like the flu, that inflation attacks other countries, but oh my gosh, the flu has arrived in America. What are we going to do now? We're going to impose these price controls. And as you were describing this phenomenon, all I was thinking was, this is the mindset of the central planner.
Yes.
That he thinks he has what Hayek called the fatal conceit that he's going to be able to pull this off. And so that's why he's using statistics from the year before. And he's there scratching his head saying, why are things so messed up? I used the right statistics. Well, because the planner doesn't conceive of the possibility that market conditions and people's valuations are changing constantly. You can't keep up with it, even if you have the 10 fastest computers in the world, that you're going to have these perversions that come with central planning. And I think it's also good to revisit Mises's, Ludwig von Mises's analysis of what happens from the standpoint of the producer. I mean, let's say you've got the gasoline station owner. He's told you cannot charge what the market will bear for your gasoline anymore. Let's say it's $5 a gallon. You only can charge $2.50 a gallon. Well, all of his costs are continuing to go up. He's got to pay employees more because their prices are going up. The food that he sells inside his store, all the things that he sells,
including the gasoline,
that everything's going up. So he figures, I can't stay in business. So what does the government do? Oh, well, we'll take care of this problem. We'll put price controls on those food suppliers that are selling you the food. No problem. And so they put price controls there, and so he's happy. Well, then what about those food producers? They're running into the same problem. So what you end up having is a totally government controlled economy if you keep following this road all the way through. And when really the ultimate solution is really just lift the controls, which is what they ultimately did. And let me also say that, when I went to Cuba many, many years ago, they had dollar stores there where, the tourists could spend dollars, and they were filled with products. I mean, you didn't have any problem there. But I asked a guy, I said, well, where's the grocery stores for the poor people here, the ones that are dealing with the Cuban currency? And he says, oh, no, we have rationing stations for food. I said, okay, why don't you take me over to one? So he guides me into a back neighborhood, and there's this rationing station, Richard. It was fascinating. They had these great big tubs like of beans and other stuff there. And people would come with their little rationing books, and they would check mark here, okay, here's your allotment of beans. And so I started to take pictures of this. This is like real life, shortages and rationing. And the station operator says to the guy that was with me that had brought me over, he was Cuban, of course, hey, they're not supposed to be taking pictures. And so my guide, he was really just a guy that he knew the system. He says, why not, comrade? We the people own these stations, don't we? But it was not an attractive thing, Richard. I mean, if you saw what they were serving out of, and people getting these things and filling up their little allotments, it's just gruesome. But that's what price controls do. They ultimately have to lead to rationing, because your price system is allocating the distribution of goods and services. So if prices are going up, people are being told, hey, you need to conserve. This is something that you just need to do because the prices are soaring. Once you tamper with that system, as you pointed out, like you would with a thermometer on a high fever going forward, how else is the government going to allocate the available goods? And that's where the rationing comes in, and that's where all the distortions come in.
Well, obviously, you were not tutored by Bernie Sanders, because Bernie Sanders was asked about rationing in places like Cuba, and he said, rationing is good. That way, poor people get the goods rather than just rich people buying them all up and everyone else starves. So, it's good. People wait their lives on those long lines, but they're all getting their equal ration share. So you see, you just didn't understand the aesthetic beauty of it, the social justice of it. Wake up, wake up. I experienced this in the Soviet Union. Prices were controlled there, fixed. They had no relationship to real supply and demand. And so you'd walk into a bread store. Everything is a retail people's bread store. There are no private businesses. And those supermarkets, there's the bread store, there's the separate meat store, there's the separate dairy store, there's a separate everything. So you walk into the people's bread store, and you get on this line, you wait, and you wait, and you wait, and you get to the line, and then maybe you might see some bread behind the counter, pumpernickel or rye, assuming they have it. And then you're given this ticket. And you take this ticket with the bread that you may want to possibly buy, and you go to a second line, and you wait, and you wait, and you wait, and you get up to where you pay it at the government-controlled prices. And then you get a receipt, a coupon, and then you get on a third line, and you wait, and you wait, and you wait to pick up it, assuming that after having paid it, there's any left behind the counter. That's how people lived. But the black market worked there as well. The black market worked there as well. So I got this online in what would be like a soft drink people's store, like had their version of like Pepsi and Coke. So I'm on this line, and I'm on this line for like 45 minutes, and I'm finally now entering the store. It's not like I'm at the counter yet. After 45 minutes, I'm like at the door entrance. I'm just in the door entrance. And suddenly the woman behind the counter says, our supply for the day is gone tomorrow. Now, while I was waiting in the door, approaching the front door, I'm looking inside, and behind the counter, it was like the back room with the inventory. And there had been a woman standing in that doorway behind the counter. And suddenly, when this woman behind the counter says, "We're out, come back tomorrow," suddenly the same woman who had been standing in the doorway of the back room is in a corner of the inside of the store saying, "Drinks for sale." This was the black market from the back room of the official retail people's store. I mean, the system was so damn corrupt. And suddenly it was available, but at a black market closer to a real price. So you see the market constantly, but the corruption of it, right? You know the amount that you're under the ration you're allowed to sell per day. You have some extra inventory, and you're just going to make some money out of it by selling what's left in the back room on the black market in front of everybody. Nobody even cared anymore, even to try to hide it. It's totally corrupt system. But that's what price controls and government rationing and distribution of output inevitably and inescapably leads to. The choice is either a free market economy where people are allowed to freely talk to each other, including through prices, and communicate to each other what they want, the value they place upon it, what they think they could do, their opportunity costs of using their time and resources and efforts in one way as opposed to another, and then bringing them together at an agreed upon mutually set of prices at which the supplies are tending to balance and match the demands. And every time something changes anywhere in the society, no matter how small or how great, like the most delicate dial indicator, it's registered in a change in the price, and people suddenly adapt and adjust and modify what they're doing, how they're doing, where they're doing, so that the pattern is always tending to be a moving coordination of multitudes of millions of people, now billions of people around the world, each doing something to match what others want for a mutual benefit of everyone.
Yeah, your point about corruption is really right on. I mean, a black market inevitably is going to form when you got price controls. And when I went to Cuba many years ago, as I mentioned earlier, I'd walk by these stores like a pharmacy, Richard, and the shelves were just bare. It was dark in there. I guess the electricity, they had stoppages there. I mean, this is the product of a managed economy. When I asked for a license to go to Cuba, because I did get permission from the Treasury Department, I said I want to study a real socialist system. In real life, I've read about socialism, I studied about it, but I want to see it in action. And boy, did I! Because Cuba, the state owns everything effectively. Yes. I'd say about 99%, and this is the results of central planning. There's before we wrap up, I'd like to recommend a nice little book that you and I were aware of many years ago, but it's one of those timeless little books called Fiat Money, Inflation in France by Andrew Dixon White. And I'd highly recommend people that are listening to this or watching it to get a copy of that book, because I think it's in that book, if I recall correctly, where he said that people that were violating the price controls in the olden days were given the death penalty. Yes. I mean, these were fiercely enforced. So at least we're thankful that the people that were violating the price controls in the 70s on gasoline were not executed, but they were given severe penalties nonetheless. But again, like I said earlier at the start of the show, Richard, I think we've made a lot of progress, because we certainly don't have price controls in response to this latest inflationary debacle of the Fed, and I don't see very many people calling for it.
Yeah, I would just supplement, what you're saying about White's book about fiat inflation, a book that I'm forgetting who the authors were, but it was called 40,000 Years of Price Controls. And it's about all of these episodes from the ancient times to the present, in which governments have attempted to control, regulate, prohibit the changes in prices, and the disaster it has always created.
Okay, on that note, we'll wrap things up. Thank you all for tuning in. Subscribe to our FFF Daily, which we have strived to make the best daily libertarian commentary page on the internet. Keep in mind, we've got our conference going on right now on Austrian economics and the impact that it has had on the speakers in this series. We've got some real Austrian stars here. Last week was just so entertaining. I mean, Ben Powell had us cracking up talking about his experience with Austrian economics. And this week we've got one of the major stars of Austrian economics and libertarianism, and that's Mark Skousen, who is undoubtedly the greatest libertarian entrepreneur that's ever lived, the organizer of Freedom Fest. And I have no doubts that Skousen is going to give a highly entertaining as well as very informative talk. He's one of the star Austrians, as Richard himself can attest. So hope to see y'all that's Thursday night. To subscribe, go to our homepage, go to upcoming events, click on the conference, register, and you'll get a Zoom link and you get to participate. And yeah, we'll be recording them and putting them on later on, but I think this is one that you're going to really enjoy participating in live. On that note, we'll wrap things up. Richard, I always enjoy the conversation. I enjoyed this week. I look forward to talking to you next week.
Until next time.